It's fantastic to be here at Columbia University and fantastic to enjoy the breadth and intellectual excitement of this place, particularly in a glorious room like this. And we had some pretty cool, funky music just then as well, which is kind of... but it's particularly pleasurable to have colleagues from Oxford, which isn't too shabby a place either, come through and provide opportunities for intellectual interaction between the two great institutions. And it's particularly exciting for me to have Charles Godfray here, who's my former colleague at Oxford University. So Charles is a population biologist. Many of you probably know him already from his many scientific papers. He's got broad interests in environmental sciences and has published in fundamental and applied areas of ecology, evolution, and epidemiology. He is currently the director of the Oxford Martin School, appointed in 2018, where he also directs the Oxford Martin programme on the future of food, which seeks to link together all research at Oxford that is related to food. So the Oxford Martin School is an amazing organisation, founded by a very, very generous donation from Jim Martin. It's fantastic that Jim's widow, Lillian Martin, is here with us today, and it's great that she's based in New York, so it's great that she's actually able to come along and join in this great occasion with us. Charles is the chair of DEFRA's Science Advisory Council. He's a trustee director of Rothamsted's research and a trustee of the Food Foundation. In 2017, he was knighted for services to scientific research and for scientific advice to government. Previously, he has been a trustee of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, a member of NERC Council, where we first met, president of the British Ecological Society, and he chaired the lead expert group of the UK government's Foresight project on the future of food and farming. Needless to say, Charles is a leading academic in this field with many years of experience. His research and publications have focused on how the global food system will need to adapt to the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, in particular the concept of sustainable intensification and the relationship between food production, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. He's also interested in the interplay of science and policy, especially in the areas of the environment and food security. Today, Charles is going to talk about the challenges of feeding a growing global population, as well as some of the possible solutions. He will explore the effects of climate change on health, agriculture, policy, and environmental and economic outputs, as well as some of the urgent greatest threats to the resiliency of global food systems. At the end of the talk, we will allow about 10 minutes for audience questions. It's fantastic to be doing this. So much of what we're talking about here is something that's a high priority for the Earth Institute, and I know a number of you are interested in food systems. Just to say, we're going to have to disappear off at 3:30, so if you want to hang around and talk to Charles, it'll have to be quick at the very end. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Charles onto the stage. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Alex. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's the first time I visited Columbia, but there are friends in the audience. It's a particular pleasure to have Lillian and her daughter, Jayron. I work at the Oxford Martin School, and we're there because of the generosity of the Martin family. It's also a particular pleasure to be introduced by Alex, who's a very good friend. You realise we've had quite a tough time in the UK. We had Brexit, but that paled into nothing compared with Alexit. So your gain here is our loss. So what I'm going to do in this talk is, first of all, I want to set the scene for some of the issues about food security going ahead. And then I want to talk about some of the modelling that we have done in the Oxford Martin programme for the future of food. And I'm going to take quite a high-level approach and sort of just ask some questions rather than go into the depth of the modelling. And I'm really happy in questions, and forgive me for rushing away, or an email to go into things in more detail. So as Alex said, my background is a population biologist. And I guess the founder of our field, population biology, and incidentally one of the sort of three founders of economics as well, is Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus is particularly famous for his essay on the principle of population. And at a time of sort of quite global optimism at the end of the 18th century, Malthus was pretty pessimistic. He talked about the geometric capacity of populations to increase, and this would undoubtedly, in his argument, outpace the ability of the earth to produce food. And if you could produce food, then all that would happen is that it would stimulate populations to grow. And Malthus was predicting severe famines in Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. And this didn't happen because of the Industrial Revolution, the complex nexus of sociological and technological changes that led to a major increase in productivity. So there weren't famines, or well, there were famines. I mean, the Irish potato famine, but that was a political famine. It wasn't a famine due to the capacity to produce food. Now, I call that the sort of first of three waves of what might be called Malthusian pessimism. And I'm just about old enough to remember the second wave, which was in the 70s, associated with Paul Ehrlich, with the Club of Rome. And again, when the realization of just how fast populations were growing by mid-century, if you reread The Population Bomb with a 21st century perspective, it's an extraordinary document advocating coercive population control and things like that. And Paul, arguing not illogically from what was known at the time, was predicting the end of democracy in Europe because of famine by the end of the 21st century. Nothing to do with Brexit. And of course, this didn't come about because of the Green Revolution, the enormous gain in productivity, interestingly, based on a relatively small number of genetic changes in yeast and such. I see Ruth in the audience who's written very interestingly on this as well. And during the 70s, this is the population crop production over the last 60 years, relatively little new land has come into agriculture, and yet crop production has been able to keep up with population growth. Although, of course, one of the consequences of this is the amount of inputs going into agriculture, I've just put fertilizer use there, have been enormous with really major consequences for the environment. So that's the second wave. And actually, from about the 1970s, after the oil price crisis, then food sort of disappeared from much of the political agenda. And it was only in 2008 when food sort of re-entered or sort of moved up at least the international political agenda. And this was due to the price volatility, the price hikes around food in 2008 and 2010. This is the FA Food Price Index. I put up both nominal and deflated because it's deflated using American inflation, which is perhaps not particularly appropriate if, say, you're a subsistence farmer or living in a informal settlement in Africa. The reality you experience is probably somewhere in the middle. And although the price volatility wasn't enormous compared with what had been experienced earlier in the 20th century, I've also put up US corn prices to give some example, a good data set going back to 1900. It triggered a whole series of political and economic issues. What caused the Arab Spring was very complex, but almost certainly increases in food prices were one of the things that contributed to it. And so food has come back up the political agenda. And are we in a third era of Malthusian pessimism? Well, again, going back to being a population biologist, I think the most extraordinary thing that has happened in my adult lifetime is that we are seeing the deceleration of population growth associated with the demographic transition. We know that if we bring people out of poverty, if we educate their children, especially girls, if we provide access to reproductive health care, then human fecundity goes down. I like to tell my students at age 60, I am more optimistic than when I was their age, and that is despite climate change. It is now intellectually possible to talk about the Malthusian demon being beaten. Now, having said that, and to put it crudely, one can say it's game on, then there are major challenges. I said one of the things that causes a deceleration of population growth is you bring people out of poverty, which is undoubtedly a good thing, but you bring people out of poverty, they quite naturally require a better diet. This is meat consumption, and you can see that in Europe, in the North America, it's fairly constant, but it's growing in China. The inset is the estimate of business as usual meat consumption through to mid-century, and it's a linear trend. And of course, meat produced by animals up the trophic level requires more resources. So there will be a continuing demand-side challenge because there will be more people, even though population growth rate is decelerating, but these people will be richer and they'll be demanding more food. And then on the supply side, I'm going to do no more than just sort of briefly look at this. And of course, there's fabulous work in the Earth Institute on this. On the supply side, there's challenges through water scarcity, and there's challenges through soil degradation and other competition for resources. So that's a very brief canter through some of the background to the food security challenge we have at the moment. And just a few, some of these I mentioned, some of them I haven't. Continuing demand growth. We've seen, and again, you guys know this, but I find that many policymakers just don't realize quite how different sub-Saharan Africa is than it was 50 years ago, with nearly 50% of people living in cities. Outside China, the biggest cities in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. This makes a huge difference to the dynamics of global food systems. Again, we still have, 800 million people going to bed calorie hungry. And actually that number's going up, although it's going up largely because these are people unfortunate enough to live in war zones or in areas with tremendous civil disturbance. Of the Millennium Development Goals, we probably did better on hunger than on any of the other ones. But then sort of crept up without any of us noticing the obesity and overnutrition epidemic. Again, going back 30 or 40 years ago, who would have imagined that that would be one of the primary health challenges affecting certainly developed economies, but increasingly developing economies? I've talked about pressures on agriculture, water scarcity, competition for land, and of course there's a resilience to shocks. And those are not only the biophysical shocks such as climate change, but the challenging political climate we're in at the moment. We have a globalized food system. The trade in global commodities is essential for keeping many areas supplied with food at a time when there's enormous pressure on global trade systems. So that's a sort of, as I said, a canter through some of the issues ahead. And I now want to switch track to some of the work we've been doing at the Martin School. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 4 questions. And again, forgive me, these will be quite high-level questions, and I'm happy to talk about details. And then describe some modeling that we've done to address them. And then right at the end, and again, just if I have time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the exciting issues around meat substitutes. So those are the 4 questions. What if we eat healthily? A question about climate change, a question about taxing climate unfriendly food, and then issues around planetary boundaries and agriculture. And this is my only sort of methods slide. We have the modeling, much of which is led by this hugely talented researcher, Marco Springman, in the school. What we've done is we have a suite of models that we've linked together. The yellow boxes are the external drivers that we take from OECD scenarios, climate change scenarios. And these are coupled to an economic model that we work with the International Food Policy Research Institute Institute in Washington. And people like Cynthia, who knows this work very well, it's the impact in the impact model. And then at Oxford, what we're able to do is we're able to take what might be called a vector of diets and then run it through a health model that has been developed by our health epidemiologists to look at health outcomes. We're building different environmental modules to put onto this model. And today I'll only be talking about the easier one to analyze, which is greenhouse gas emissions, but we're working on others around water, nitrogen, and biodiversity. And we're beginning to dip our toes into looking at some of the economic consequences of it. And again, the impact model underlying it, it's a partial equilibrium model from the of a typical economic type. So that's the methods slide. And again, for those of you who are modelers, forgive me for going through that quite quickly. So this is the first question that I want to ask. And this is, what if we eat healthily? So by that I mean, what if we actually, by mid-century, adopted the type of diets that the World Health Organization, WHO, the World Health Organization, say is pretty good, optimal for our health? And we try to do this in a fairly sophisticated way, so we don't assume everyone on Earth will eat exactly the same diet. We try and assume that this transition will occur taking account of local culture and food supply. So people in Japan will eat differently from Kenya, from here. And what we're interested is both what are the gains of making this transfer, making this diet change, and what are the potential co-benefits. And as I said, I'm going to look at two co-benefits here, greenhouse gas emissions, and to begin to explore economics. And I guess the caveat I would put about modeling like this is that they're projections into the future. They're not predictions. And to me as a modeler, the real function of modeling is to help you try and understand complex nonlinear processes. So you just can't argue them through using the English or any other language. You have to use a quantitative approach. So in a sense, I'm telling you not to believe what I'm going to show you, but if you don't believe it, then that's helpful because you then go and try and look at the assumptions that gave you that result. So with that caveat, let me first go try and answer this question. And I'm going to show you a couple of maps where we not only give global statistics, but look at what happens throughout the world. Now, in these Brexit times, I applied to the UK government for the standard UK map, and I was given this, but if you look at the position of the UK, we're a bit unhappy with it, so we moved the UK to its rightful position there. So what is the health benefit if you make this diet transition? Well, we all have to die from something, but the question that we're asking is, what fewer diet-associated deaths would you get if you made this diet transition? And the bold figure is that if you did that, there would be 5 million avoided deaths per year. Now, what does that number mean? I mean, with huge respect for the people who actually suffer this. My other project that I've worked on for many years is on the mosquitoes that transmit malaria. Malaria is the most dangerous infectious disease of humans. And malaria kills about 500,000 people a year. So in this horrible calculus of death, and as I said, I mean this with no disrespect for the people afflicted, then we're talking about an order of magnitude greater than that. Now, that's not quite a fair comparison because malaria tends to get you younger than diet-related deaths. But I hope you'll accept that this is a really major public health goal, and we need to talk more about diets. Now, the darker colors in the map is where there are most benefits. And certainly before we did this work, I assumed that most of the benefits would be in sub-Saharan Africa and places like that. But no, actually, a lot of the diet-related deaths are in the rich world, are in Europe and North America. So many of the benefits are in the developed world. So yes, a really big gain, potential gain from dietary change. What difference would it make to greenhouse gas emissions from the environment? Well, business as usual, we expect there to be 50% more emissions from food production by 2050. Merely by changing diets so that you eat healthily, that would go down from 50% to a 7% rise. Now, as many of you in the audience, especially Cynthia will tell you, we have to do much better than that. It's a question of reducing emissions, not just stabilizing them. But this is just diet change alone before you do all the other technical, agronomic things that you could do to reduce emissions from agriculture. So a very major health and environment co-benefit there. Now, the other point I want to make is the green areas the green countries are the countries where the greenhouse gas emissions would go down if we ate healthily. The orange areas is where they would go up. And these are the poor countries where people have poor diets. The message that I take from this is that we in the rich world have to do even more to reduce our emissions so that people have a poor diet at the moment. They have to be allowed to produce more emissions to have the diet. I think everyone would agree it would be ethically wrong to expect anything else. So that's a health and environment co-benefit. Now, when I said you shouldn't believe what I said, I think this particularly applies to this slide, especially the one on the right. So this is where we try and look at economic co-benefits from switching to a healthy diet. And these are some figures here. And I put in the bottom the gross GDP of the world, just to give you some framing about what these numbers mean. So if you use estimates such as the social cost of carbon, then you are getting benefits of making this dietary transition of, well, you can see the figures there, 0.2 trillion. And if you look at the direct, that's the healthcare costs, and the indirect costs of the diseases that would be involved, indirect time off work and things, then one is pushing those more direct costs, those costs that you can be a little bit more economically certain of, you're pushing them up to about $1 trillion US per year. Now, if you take some of the measures that economists try to use, hedonic measures, to get some idea of what you would pay for those extra years of life and things, then you're getting figures much bigger. And again, with all the caveats around these economic methods, it depends quite critically on the questions you ask. But you're getting figures that, are pushing towards 10% of global GDP. Again, I don't think one should look very particularly at the figures, but I would argue that there is a triple benefit of diet change here: better health, better environment, and better and economic benefits as well. And as I said, I'm not presenting results on some of the other environmental dimensions which we're working on at the moment, but I think they will come out in a similar direction. So that's the first question I wanted to ask. The second question is around climate change, and how will climate change affect diet-related mortality by 2050? And we do this using the same type of mathematical approach. Excuse me. And what we did is we assumed a scenario that will result in 2 degrees global warming, which strikes me, unfortunately, as at the bottom of what is likely to happen. And then we model effects of climate on plant growth and production. I should have said that the IFPRI model has crop models attached to it, so you can take a climate projection and say how that affects yields, and then the economics of the impact model tells you how those effects on yields will affect the price of food and hence diets. And again, a figure at the bottom for framing. We published this a couple of years back in 2016, and at that time, and there have since been a couple of other studies, the WHO, a sort of expert opinion approach, estimated that climate change through diet could cause about 85,000 extra deaths a year. Now, so let me tell you our results. Now, the first thing to emphasize, and
again, we must remember there are some really good news around diets. As I said, we did meet the Millennium Development Goal on diets. And business as usual, assuming a typical OECD economic scenario, we would expect that by mid-century there would be 2 million less deaths a year due to associated with diets, largely because people are becoming richer and coming and moving out of poverty. So that's a prediction, business as usual, and with no climate change. Now, what our modelling suggests that things will still be getting better, largely through economic growth, but they will not be as good in the presence of climate change. And in particular, there'll be roughly 500,000 deaths that would have been avoided if it wasn't for climate change. 500,000 diet-related deaths. Now, climate change may cause other mortality, but this is a bit mediated through climate change. Now, what we can do is we can take that 500,000 deaths, whoops, going the wrong way, which I've done there, and then we can say, well, where do they come from? And we can sort of parse this in a different way through the modelling. And climate change will have both positive and negative effects. And these balance out at about 500,000. And this is what the model suggests will be the effect. So first of all, if we look below the line, these are the good news of climate change, if that doesn't sound perverse. It does sound perverse, actually, because it's good news in terms of diet-related deaths, but it's largely because people are coming out of poverty more slowly, which of course will have consequences for demography, and fewer people will be going into the overweight class, and in particular, fewer people will be going into the obese class. So this trend we're seeing in some developing countries, and actually even least developed countries, will be slowed down a bit by climate change. And there's a sliver there for deaths associated with red meat. So that's, and again with inverted commas around the positive effects of climate change, but the negative effects come under two categories. First, in exactly the same way that fewer people will be entering the overweight and obese classes, fewer will be coming out of the underweight classes. And so the diseases associated with poor nutrition will not drop as fast in the presence of climate change. And we get a big effect on fruits and vegetables. Now, to me, this is one of the things where modelling is useful. So the way that the effects of fruit and vegetable on diet are parameterized is using the best meta-analyses of the data that are available. But we know going back that actually the information both on how fruit and veg affects health, and in particular on how climate change affects fruit and veg going into the future, is less certain than, for example, the effects of climate change on maize and wheat and rice, thanks to AgMIP and Cynthia's colleagues in these wonderful comparisons. So to me, actually, one of the valuable things of doing this modelling exercise is not to make projections, but to tell you where you need more research. And I certainly think that we need a much better understanding of how fruit and vegetables will be affected by climate change going ahead, and also how fruit and vegetable affects health as well. So that was my second question. My third question is sort of now moving from sort of predictions of what might, well, I now contradict myself, projections of what might happen ahead to what one might do about them. And I want to start by asking a question that is deliberately simplistic, and that is, what if we tax climate unfriendly food? And it's simplistic for a number of levels. First of all, the political reality of having a global food tax is, of course, silly. And it's only one type of, we're just looking at climate. But I think the justification for doing something of this type is that it shows you the policy space within which a fiscal intervention might work. So what we did is we used the best life cycle analysis we could find to look at the greenhouse gas emissions of different food types. We introduced a proportionate tax, and we then went and looked for perverse effects and then went back to see if we could redesign a tax system to get rid of some of these perverse effects. And as I said, I want to be very clear that we do realize that this is quite a simplistic first step. So here is what, if you were to do something, introduce a tax of this type, what effect it would make on price. So prices go up, and that's a blue histogram above the line, and what effect it would make on consumption, that is the red histogram below the line. And of course, those of you who are economists will know that there are assumptions about elasticities and cross-elasticities in there. We've tried to do our best. Again, I think one of the things that comes out of a model like this is quite how much we need better data to parameterize these type of economic models. I won't go through all the different food types. You can see beef on the side is the one that has the greatest greenhouse gas effects, and so would attract the greatest tax and would lead to, and that tax would cause the biggest consumption. Of course, there is some assumptions in there. You can produce beef in many different ways, and we've tried to incorporate that in with different production systems, but I do realize that lumping something quite as variable as beef into one character is quite simple. And then I'll just read the first few coming down for those of you at the back: beef, oils, milk, lamb, poultry, and then we're getting into some of the plant-based foods which have far less greenhouse gas emissions. Interesting, pork is quite down there as well, and eggs as relatively low emissions. Okay, so we put on this tax, and then we sort of go back to the model and see what happens. And I'm going to first give you the headline effect of what it would get, and I've deliberately blanking out the map for the moment. So we put that in and we turn the handle, and what it predicts is that there is actually a health benefit of this environment tax for exactly the reasons that I talked about a little bit earlier. You're making fruit and vegetable proportionately cheaper, which is good. You're reducing some of the red meat, which has some effects, although not huge effects on health. And in a way, the type of ballpark figure you get out is 100,000 avoided deaths. But you actually make quite a big difference on the greenhouse gas emissions. And 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide. Now, I know there are people in the room who live and breathe gigatons, but for me, I need some framing. And a gigaton of CO2, a reduction, it's about, and I fear there are people who know far more about this in the room than me, it's about 10% of what one needs to do to keep the change in temperature below 2 degrees. So this seems quite good, but now let us look at where those avoided deaths occur. And the avoided deaths are in green, and most of them are in the rich world. Now, where it's orange and red, that's not avoided deaths. A consequence of our tax that we've put on in this very simplistic way is that people in poor countries are having a worse diet, and in some of them, where it's really red, then there is a dramatic increase in number of deaths. So, of course, this is politically and ethically unacceptable and ethically wrong. But what you can then do is then go back and say, well, that's your first pass. Let's try and do something a little bit more sophisticated. Let's, for example, not have the tax affect at all the least developed countries. So if you do that, and I won't go into the details, but you try and optimize a tax regime across broad countries. This is the difference you get. And just before changing it, just remind you again of what the simplistic results are: 100K avoided deaths and 1 gigaton of reduced emissions. Now, if you then optimize it, then you go from 100,000 avoided deaths to 500,000 avoided deaths, and largely because you're not having these negative effects in the world's poorest countries. What emissions cost do you bear for that? Well, remember, it's 1 gigaton before, and it's only gone down 0.1. So again, I think the message I get for this is the policy space in which fiscal interventions around food type could take place is quite large. And we're dipping our toes in it in the rich world around soda taxes and fat taxes. Politically, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but as the need to act on climate change gets greater, I suspect there might be a change in the political will to do things like this. And it is, I would suggest, quite an effective solution, quite an effective approach, I should say. Okay, my fourth question is, can we feed the world within planetary boundaries? And this is work we did that fed into the Eat Lancet Commission on Global Diets that was published. So it's separate from that, but it fed into them. Now, I guess many of you will be familiar with planetary boundaries. It's the idea largely associated with Johan Rockström that there are, and don't worry about the details of this, I'll pick out a couple of minutes, that there are boundaries around the amount of biodiversity we have left, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus we put into the environment, the amount of greenhouse gases we produce, that there are boundaries within which we need to remain, and Johan calls it the safe operating space for humanity. Now, I guess I share reservations about planetary boundaries with many people. Is it really a boundary? Do we know where it is? Is it not much more complicated than that? But it is a tremendously valuable tool in communicating some of the issues going ahead. So I think one can use planetary boundaries as a tool to sort of explore some of these issues, as long as one is really clear about some of the shortcomings and assumptions that underlies planetary boundaries. Anyway, what we did was we took a series of the planetary boundaries that are related to agriculture. And we did 5, actually. One is land use. The other is fresh water use, so water use. Climate change, obviously greenhouse gas emissions. And nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. And what we then did was to say, well, of the pressure on planetary boundaries, on each of these 5 planetary boundaries from the food system, what particular food types are responsible? So for climate change, then what types of food are pressing against the planetary boundary? And similarly for fresh water. So I'm going to show a slide now, and forgive me, it's a little bit complex, and I'm only going to mention a couple of things. So have a look at the top 2 horizontal bars. These are greenhouse gas emissions. And the top bar, which sums to 100%, is the different parts of the food system that are responsible for greenhouse gases at the moment. Now, below at the bottom, you'll see the different food types, but I'm only going to mention 2 types. The one in red is livestock, and the one in yellow are the staple crops, the maize, the wheat, the rice, etc. And the second of each of those pair of horizontal bars is what it would look like business as usual by mid-century. So if we look at the top pair of bars, that's greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see that's dominated by red, that's dominated by livestock. So the effect of the food system on planetary boundary, on that particular planetary boundary, the greenhouse gas emissions, is dominated by livestock. Then if you look at the others, and just going down them, there's land use, water, nitrogen, and phosphorus, then you can see that the yellow is more dominant. So the yellow is the sort of broadacre crops, the staple crops and things. So this is a sort of parsing of the effects of different food types on different planetary boundaries. So what we then did was then to say, well, if one was trying to reduce the effects of the food system on these different planetary boundaries, what are the solutions that you should invest in? What are the most likely things to have an effect? And we considered 4, and forgive me, this is another slightly busy slide. We considered 4 possible classes of solution. One is just reducing loss and weight. The other is technology. And let me just explain what I mean by that. We know from really good econometric studies that there is a pretty good relationship between what we invest in agriculture and the productivity gains that result. And we know that ultimately there must be a ceiling, but I think most people think there's a bit of a way to go before we get that ceiling. So we asked, what would happen if we doubled the investment in agricultural research at the moment, both in plant genetics and in livestock breeding, and then took a statistical econometric approach to what that would do with productivity. So that's the second one. There's waste, there's investing in productivity research, and flex is going flexitarian. So we're not assuming you go vegetarian, but we're assuming that you are going a little bit beyond WHO in terms of reducing your meat, the amount of meat you eat. And for the 5 planetary boundaries listed along the bottom, that's what makes a difference. So diet change, if you care about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, diet change is what you need to concentrate on. For most of the others, then technology, investment in technology is important. And you know, certainly in the UK and in Europe, less so, but still occurring in the States, we have taken our foot off the gas of investing in agronomic research, partly because of the 50 years where food prices have been stable. I'm an entomologist by background. I remember when I was 25, someone from government saying, you work on controlling aphids. Actually, aphids are good for the country. They reduce the amount of subsidies we have to pay farmers. So that has all gone. We need to think again about serious investment in agricultural research. Okay, so those were the 4 questions I was going to ask, and I have a few minutes left. So I thought I'd just finish on some work we're doing at the moment. And this was partly prompted by the World Economic Forum asking us to do a report for their annual meeting in January about some of the issues around meat alternatives. And one of the joys about working in the Martin School and being able to look across the whole university is we can pull in whatever people we need to address a particular issue. And we've done some research that sort of involves both physicists and climate change people, but also some social scientists who are trying to understand the social dynamics of diet change. It's all very well for, I'm a natural scientist, it's all very well for natural scientists to say we have to change diets, but that's not sufficient to work out how diets will actually change. So it's a really interesting time for meat alternatives at the moment. Impossible Burgers at the top there have just got a contract with Burger King. Punters are willing to spend 50% more at Burger King to have a non-meat burger. Quorn is a British invention. It's marketed a little bit in the States. How many of you who are not Brits have heard of Quorn? Oh, I'm glad some people have. So it's a mycoprotein, and I'm afraid the Brits rather foolishly marketed it in the States as protein from mushrooms. And the American Mushroom Association took out a libel suit against them. And so I think forced them to call it protein from mold rather than it. But Quorn is a really interesting, it was starved of investment for many years. It fell into private equity, but they've now got owners who are really investing it. It's still very early, but, well, actually, I'm glad that we've just heard a cricket there, because bottom right, it came up just as the grasshopper. So whoever's phone went off, I'm really grateful for the sound effect to help me make my point there. And I skipped over, because of the fortuitous cricket, the just meat. So that's not yet on the market, but is attracting serious investment. And some of the big US meat companies, Tyson's, for example, Cargill's, they are now putting serious money investing in these different alternatives. Now, cultured meat in particular, there are some pretty optimistic estimates going out there about their greenhouse gas emissions. And when we did the analysis, then the meta-analysis of LCAs that exist at the moment are not as optimistic as I think many people think. So, for example, cultured beef there comes in a little bit behind actual beef. Now, I don't, when we published this, it upset some people in the cultured beef community. I don't think they should be upset. This is a very embryonic technology. There's a huge capacity to improve what they could do there. So, but what this graph, I think, shows that the plant-based meat alternatives, which actually are the nearest to market, that's where Impossible Burgers come from, they have really substantial greenhouse gas estimates there. I just want to take a slight detour in some work that's come out of two people from the Martin School, John Lynch and Ray Pierre Humbert. Again, as many of you will know, there are some interesting things about the specific types of greenhouse gas molecules that livestock produce. So along with deep water rice, beef is the largest source of methane. Now, methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2, but it turns over much faster. So if you're eating meat at a constant rate, then if the outputs of CO2, they are increasing in a cumulative way. But when you get to a constant rate, then methane is turning over. Now, you can get, depending on exactly the type of greenhouse gases that are produced by cultured meat, it is conceivable that things could be worse if you're substituting methane for carbon dioxide. So we all tell our students that never to confuse something that's cumulative, a stock and a flow. Well, you have to think about these two different, the two different processes that are going. So some cultured meat scenarios are clearly better than beef, but not all. And so it's sort of caveat that we need to be quite careful here. So my final couple of slides are from some quantitative social science that's been done by a very talented researcher called Alex Sexton in the school. And what she did, and I should say that this is just using UK data, is that she sort of scraped the web and Twitter and things and got all the information, or all the data she could about people discussing artificial meat and meat substitutes. And then she used complicated multivariate statistics to try and define different narratives. And I won't go through all of them, but these are the different narratives. So in the multidimensional space, you get different clusters. You then go back to see what they're associated with. And you can define them with certain narratives. And I think the interesting thing that came out of it is most of the chatter on the web around the benefits of artificial food came round to alternative proteins do not harm animals. So nothing to do with the environment, nothing to do with health. It was because, and especially among that generation, the millennial generation, it was reduction of harm to animals. And then you can look at the cautionary narratives, the people who are arguing against artificial meat. And again, there were 4 clusters there. And the one that was strongest is around this notion of authenticity. And again, especially among millennials, really care about authenticity. Alternative protein products are not real food. So this is just beginning work. But again, as a natural scientist, I am really impressed by some of the insights that this new sort of field of quantitative social science can provide. So, a couple of conclusions. First, food systems are entering into uncharted waters. I am optimistic, but that in no way underlines some of the issues ahead. There are no silver bullets. We have to talk about production. We have to talk about consumption. You can't just say agriculture can solve us or diet change can solve us. The challenges are sufficiently great. It would be foolish not to try and push on all fronts. A couple of specific conclusions. We need a new green revolution. A green revolution that's different from the last revolution, that is as much about resource efficiency as it is about increased productivity. We need to take serious action on diets. And something I've not talked about today is better governance of the global food system. Joe Stiglitz, who I'm a huge admirer of from here, said, we have globalization, get over it. The real challenge is how do we make globalization work for everyone? And in the food system, that's hugely important. And finally, and in a sense it's probably the wrong audience, it doesn't need to be said, but talking to general audiences, whatever do you care most about? I'm a biologist by background. I care deeply about biodiversity. You may care about other things. Food is special. If we fail on food, we fail on everything. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions? Please keep them really short, and so we've got time for as many people as possible. Yes, at the back.
So first I wanted to say I'm deeply honored, Sir Godfray, for you to be here at Columbia today. I spent the previous 2 hours before I arrived late reviewing all of your videos from Oxford and the Martin program. So I wanted to preface that.
I think that's what's called a cruel and unnatural punishment.
No, actually I find it very wonderful. I work in a pantry here in New York. So I just wanted to say, this is my question. My question is, do you find it in your colleagues' study much easier to apply a pejorative system of taxing to the human population for changing their ways and eating habits than it is to apply some other system?
So I think it's politically, at the moment, much harder to put in a fiscal, to impose a tax. Of course, subsidies are just taxes going the other direction. That is perhaps what one should think about first. There are a lot of perverse subsidies out there. I would like to have shown you modelling on perverse subsidies, but we just don't have good enough data to try and do it. So I guess I would start first with subsidies, think about taxes. Of course, education is important, but one of the things I find depressing, and actually we have some really good people studying this at Oxford, the evidence about consciousness raising and even really good labellings, the effect that makes on behavioural change is much less than you would have hoped.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Currently, I'm living and working in El Salvador on environmental and climate issues. And one thing that we're looking at in terms of food security, because it's very, very serious in the whole tropical area, if we have a worst case scenario, basically that zone is desert. We're looking at, number one, a drawdown strategy of atmospheric carbon dioxide, utilizing the rescue of biodiversity, because there's many species of trees that can produce to a greater extent than the basic rains, number one. And number two, there's a whole dimension of the world. This is the blue planet. 80%, almost 80% of the planet is marine world. And there was a study done to the effect that if we just covered 9% of the ocean with marine algae, we can pull down 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And with a small area, 180,000 square kilometers, we could feed the human population. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. I know, and again, there's been some research on this at the Martin School. I think one, and actually Cynthia may be better placed to answer this, you have to be very careful about some of the perverse things that might happen, because you can only get that type of productivity if you put a lot of nutrients and iron into the ocean. And I guess I just want to be clear I understood the biogeochemical cycles before I did something like that at scale.
Cynthia behind. No, over here. Sorry, Cynthia behind you.
We can talk about those kinds of geoengineering type things. And IPCC, this I think in the sixth assessment are taking them up. So I think that'll be good to get some clear assessments. 3 quick points. Charles, first of all, thank you so much for your talk and also your leadership on food security worldwide. We want to continue to work with you through AgMIP with multi-model approaches, because then we can help to improve the rigor of these kinds of projections and seeing what kind of model uncertainty is changes within them. So that we've already started, but want to continue. The second is the role of food shocks, which you mentioned early on in your talk. A lot of the modeling just doesn't do a good job. Like the economic models that a lot of this work is done with doesn't really deal with interannual variability and working together to bring that into the modeling framework. And that's why we're holding a workshop at the Aspen Global Change Institute next month on. So want to share, as I shared with you and everybody, about that. Finally, and this is in part of the discussion around the IPCC, land, special report on land, which is happening now. There's a lot of focus on the diets and the changes in the demand side, but also at the same time we have to think about the producers and the transitions for them, and how do we, for, let's say, some of the countries that depend very, very strongly for their, for example, beef production and meat production. At the same time as we're working on really bringing this new demand side dietary change, which is absolutely fantastic and absolutely needed, but at the same time, we have to think about the producers and especially smallholders, but also these some very important countries and their agricultural production.
I couldn't agree more with you. And of course, you don't need me to say quite what a hero Cynthia is, both as a scientist, but in getting together this wonderful community of modelers in AgMet, which is just a service to the whole community. The two things you pointed out and shocks, I completely agree. Our model struggles for anything under 6 months. We're trying to explore some of the consequences of a major African swine flu outbreak at the moment in China, and I think we need new models which turn over faster than that. If we've learned anything from the rise of populism around the world, is we need to pay much, much more attention to the losers. It's no good to take a sort of Benthamite plus and minus. The losers really make a difference. I've been working in Washington with IFPRI today, and we're wondering whether we can get some handle on the question you just asked by coupling impact, the partial equilibrium model, with a computable generally model, so that you can have a look at some of the employment consequences and how that's buffered by different sectors. And we think that the consequences of diet change to employment, you almost don't need a model to say this, will depend on what's happening in the rest of the economy. And I think the policy message from that is exactly when you do things, you need to, to use an appropriate agricultural metaphor, make hay when the sun shines.
Okay. We have one last question here.
Thank you. Earlier in your presentation, you reported that malaria was a major, if not the top, cause of death.
From infectious diseases.
But I heard malaria.
Yes.
Okay, but being that it is transmitted with mosquito insect, I did not see or hear you discuss the insects as a major contributor to one's health, and being as much as you reported on like beef and diet. Is there a correlation between the insects and the diet and the protein from beef and the diet? I am a Texan, so I grew up on beef.
Yes.
And I'm very healthy. And I also had malaria, but it has been eradicated after many years.
Yes, forgive me, can you just say your question again at the end?
The question is,
yes.
You spoke about malaria being a top contributor to death.
Yeah.
Is that insect transmitted disease impacting diet more or less than the beef industry?
I don't think it's impacting death. Now, perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned malaria. I was just trying to give some framing of what the diet-related deaths
look like. Now, the Global Burden of Disease Group, based in Seattle, published last week a really interesting paper where they looked at the comparative effect on avoided deaths of different components, so the different type of infected diseases and diets. And I think the interesting thing that we're seeing is we used to be killed by infectious diseases in the developed world, and now essentially we're not. And increasingly in the developing world, I mean, the news of malaria is really quite good. It is going down. So we're seeing a transition that deaths due to infectious diseases are being replaced by deaths due to non-communicatable diseases. And in a sense, we have to put more attention on the latter increasingly throughout the world.
Okay, Lily. This is going to be the last question.
A lot of this is based on modeling. Are your models non-stationary or stationary models?
They're non-stationary.
Like David Henry?
Oh, sorry. So Lillian we have a wonderful statistician. Ours are process models as opposed to David's models, which are econometric. So that division between stationary and non-stationary applies to his type of statistical model, not to the type of process models that we're looking at here.